Hey everyone, welcome to the channel and I hope you're doing well. If you're new here, we talk about mystery, crime and some history, so if you're interested be sure to stick around. Anyway, let's get into today's case. John Paul Getty III was a member of the wealthy Getty family. It was for this reason, and in the hopes of receiving a large ransom for his release, that he was kidnapped in Italy in 1973. But his grandfather, John Paul Getty Sr., was reluctant to pay the ransom. This is the story of his kidnapping and its aftermath. John Paul Getty III was born on the 4th of November 1956 as Eugene Paul Getty in Minneapolis, in the state of Minnesota. Later he would adopt the name John instead of Eugene, in imitation of his grandfather. He was born into an auspicious American family. His great-grandfather was George Getty, who at the very beginning of the 20th century had begun the family's ascent in American business through the development of oil wells in Oklahoma, a state which had actually surpassed both Texas and California in terms of oil production at the time. George amassed a fortune, but it was his son John Paul Getty Sr. who really expanded things when he discovered a number of extremely valuable wells in Oklahoma, using the money he had borrowed from his father. By the late 1910s, Jean Paul was a millionaire, and this wealth expanded exponentially in the years that followed, as Getty expanded into other oil-producing regions, notably becoming one of the first Americans to begin investing in oil exploration in the Middle East. Getty Oil was established in 1942, by which time Getty was a billionaire in today's terms. Thus, the family that his grandson, John Paul Getty III, was born into in 1956 was one of the wealthiest in America. Because of Getty's family's wide range of business interests overseas, the Gettys often lived abroad, particularly in Europe. Jean Paul Sr. himself lived in London for many years, and John Paul Getty III's father, Eugene Paul Getty, was sent to Rome to head up the family's European business in the late 1950s. As a result, John Paul largely grew up in the Italian capital in the 1960s. Although his parents divorced in 1964, he remained here and attended St. George's British International School in the city. That is until he was expelled from the school in 1972, when he was just 15, for painting a lewd term which was aimed at the school's principal across a hallway of the school. John Paul was possibly acting out at this stage owing to his peculiar home life. His father had married again in 1966 to Talitha Poll, a Dutch model and socialite, but she died of a heroin overdose in 1971, and Eugene Getty had fled to London afterwards to avoid any prosecution over the drugs in the incident, leaving John Paul in Rome with his mother. All said, it was a highly dysfunctional background. Having been expelled from school with little order in his life as a late teenager, John Paul adopted a bohemian lifestyle in 1972. He became an artist and began taking an interest in Italy's left-wing politics at a time when the country was seeing a huge upsurge in radical political movements. However, he was also largely cut off from the family's wealth as a result of his perceived waywardness, and there is concrete evidence that John Paul had flirted with the idea of having himself falsely kidnapped and splitting the ransom with those who pretended to apprehend him. Given the family's wealth, he assumed a large payment could be acquired. It also seems clear that he had even gone as far as contacting individuals who might have been able to arrange this, and that these same pretend kidnappers had ties to the Italian crime syndicate, the 'Ndrangheta. Nevertheless, Getty soon pulled a plug on the scheme. Early in 1973, he was paid a $1,000 commission to appear naked on the front cover of Playman magazine, and this alleviated his financial difficulties for the time being. Yet, those who he had been in discussion with about arranging the kidnapping had other ideas. In the early hours of the morning of the 10th of July 1973, John Paul Getty III was on the Piazza Farnese, the main square of the Regola district in central Rome, when he was bustled into a car by some unknown assailants. He was quickly blindfolded and then driven away for a long time. He would not have known where he was, but at the end of the journey, he was in southern Italy, in the Calabria region, at the southern extremity of the Italian peninsula, the toe of the boot as it is commonly described. Here he was led into a cave, where he would be held captive for several months. Getty had been kidnapped by the 'Ndrangheta, one of Italy's most powerful organised crime syndicates, and one which virtually ruled the Calabria region in the 1970s. This was a time in Italy's history during the 1970s when a large amount of high-profile kidnappings were taking place by organised crime outfits throughout Italy. Most famously, the later kidnapping of the former Prime Minister Aldo Moro in 1978 by the Red Brigade. Two high-ranking members of the 'Ndrangheta, Girolamo Piromali and Severio Mammoliti, were the masterminds of Getty's kidnapping. They now issued a demand for a ransom of $17 million to be paid in exchange for John Paul's safe release. The 'Ndrangheta might have expected that John Paul Getty Sr. would simply pay the ransom for his grandson, and that would be the end of that. After all, the money sought, while significant, was a drop in the ocean for the oil tycoon, but they were wrong. John Paul Getty Sr. was notoriously parsimonious. In his home in London, he had installed a coin-operated payphone downstairs, so that business associates and other visitors had to pay for phone calls that they made there. More sinisterly, he once scolded his fifth wife Louise for spending too much money on their son's medical care. The son in question, Timothy Getty, had a brain tumour, which resulted in him going blind. So, it was certainly wrong to assume that Jean Paul Getty Sr. would simply pay the ransom, and the oil man was soon noting to others that he had 14 grandchildren. If he paid one ransom, he'd soon be paying others for more kidnapped children. Moreover, there was a suspicion amongst some family members that the whole kidnapping was an act that John Paul had engineered himself to get at his grandfather's money. Thus, the first demand for the ransom met with resistance and refusal. A second demand was sent a few weeks later, but it was sent as a posted demand, and in the summer and autumn of 1973, 180,000 Italian postal workers were periodically engaged in strike action, in what was the largest such strike since the Second World War. As a consequence, the second ransom note took weeks to arrive to the Getty family. In the meantime, John Paul's conditions were deteriorating. At first, his captors seemed to have treated him reasonably well. He was not hurt and was allowed some amenities to pass the time, including a radio. However, as their ransom demands fell on deaf ears, the 'Ndrangheta members became more abusive. He was deprived of any distractions, and his captors tortured him psychologically by pressing an empty gun to his head and pulling the trigger. This all culminated in early November, when his captors finally cut off his right ear. Things had now deteriorated badly. The 'Ndrangheta sent a lock of his hair and the severed ear to an Italian newspaper, along with the threat that further mutilations would be carried out if their demands were not met. Meanwhile, in the cave in Calabria, Getty's ear wound had become badly infected, and despite being given penicillin to treat it, this only worsened the situation, as Getty was allergic to the antibiotic. His captors made him write a plea for the ransom to be paid, and this was printed shortly after in a second newspaper. They also let it be known at this point that they would accept a reduced ransom of $3 million. In London, it was now crystal clear that the ransom would have to be paid, and that whatever suspicions there were that John Paul had engineered the kidnapping himself were misplaced. But his grandfather was still unwilling to pay the $3 million demanded. In a miserly arrangement which he concocted with his accountant, the billionaire patriarch of the Getty family agreed to provide $2.2 million as a ransom. This was the largest sum that he could write off against taxes. The rest of the money, $800,000, he did provide to his son Eugene, John Paul's father, but as a loan at a 4% interest rate. In this miserly fashion, John Paul's ransom was paid. John Paul was soon released from captivity. He was dropped off at a petrol station in the Lauria region of Potenza in southern Italy on the 15th of December 1973, just over 5 months after his initial kidnapping. A lengthy police investigation ensued, and in the months that followed, 9 of the kidnappers were arrested and charged. Some of them, such as Girolamo Biromali, were later found to be in possession of the banknotes which had been used to pay the ransom and which were tracked. Several, however, were acquitted owing to a lack of evidence, and most of the money was never recovered. It is generally assumed that it was invested in buying trucks, with which the 'Ndrangheta was able to win several lucrative transportation contracts in the Calabria region in the years that followed. John Paul was free, but he was deeply disturbed by the episode, which had gone on for months, and which had resulted in the permanent loss of his ear. Moreover, in the latter stages of his captivity, as his health deteriorated, his captors had begun plying Getty with large amounts of brandy to try and keep his pain at bay. Perhaps this contributed to his behaviour afterwards, for Getty began increasingly abusing alcohol and drugs in the aftermath of his kidnapping. Years later, this would end in a further tragedy. For a time, his life was not all disorder and chaos. The year after his kidnapping, he married Gisela Martin Zacher, a German author and director, whom he had been dating prior to the kidnapping. They had a son, Balthazar, and John Paul began working as an actor, featuring in films by luminaries including a young Wim Wenders. For a time, the young couple moved to New York City and moved in bohemian circles there, but throughout these years, John Paul's drug and alcohol addictions continued to get worse and worse. The second major incident of Getty's life occurred in 1981 when he had a massive stroke, which was induced by taking a cocktail of alcohol, Valium, and methadone. Getty was just 25 years of age. This left him quadriplegic, half-blind, and without the ability to speak properly. He would never fully recover and spent much of the remainder of his life being cared for by his mother. Despite this, Getty did make a partial recovery over the years. His son Balthazar would later recall that Getty continued to try and live his life as well as he could, given his physical limitations, and this included having a special attachment manufactured for his wheelchair so that he could go skiing, a pursuit the family had enjoyed in northern Italy 20 years earlier. A friend, Philippe Mora, recalled that he always had this hunger to know what was going on. If anyone mentioned anything scandalous or risque, he loved it. He definitely didn't want people feeling sorry for him. John Paul Getty III died on the 5th of February 2011 at the age of 54, and 30 years after suffering from his stroke. The story of his kidnapping has attracted a lot of attention over the years, owing to his high profile and the questionable behaviour of his grandfather in responding to the ransom demand. Most recently, in a 2017 film, All the Money in the World, directed by Ridley Scott, and a Danny Boyle-directed television show, Trust, which appeared just a few months after Scott's film. Thank you everyone for watching this video on John Paul Getty III. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of the case and his grandfather's reaction down below in the comments. If you have any suggestions, also leave them in the comments, and I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next video. Thanks.